This leads us to our next topic. The growing tides of anti-Semitism in Europe make headlines on an almost daily basis as calls to boycott Israel and increasing anti-Jewish hostility have seemingly become the norm. And despite the condemnation of anti-Semitism by many European leaders, this continues to remain a very worrisome trend, as we've just heard from the surveys across some of Europe's major countries. Joining us today to discuss the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, straight from Europe, is Professor Shlomo Shapira, Director of the European Institute of Bar-Ilan University and an expert on European affairs. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So first, I'd like to talk about the recent statistics which have found dramatic increases in anti-Semitism across the UK, France, and Germany. We've heard the saying, Europe is lost to the Jews. Do these figures show that this is in fact the case?
I think this is an exaggeration. While not trying to play down the anti-Semitic incidents which are on the rise, to say that Europe is lost for the Jews means we're backing off and leaving the ground to the extremists. There are very large and well-developed Jewish communities in Europe, and withdrawal is not an option. We have to fight anti-Semitism wherever it is. And I have to say that as we see a rise in anti-Semitism, so do we also see a rise in the actions of various governments, not only police and military forces, but also social forces within these countries to combat anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm. So you've mentioned sort of the counter to anti-Semitism, and we've heard condemnation of attacks against Jews by leaders in France, the UK, and Germany. But this doesn't seem to necessarily have an impact at the end of the day. What are your thoughts on that?
Attacks receive instant attention. De-radicalization efforts and social efforts take years, if not decades. But the fact is that with the rise of anti-Semitism, we also see a rise of combating anti-Semitism. Europe has always had Jewish communities and will always have. That having been said, Jews are now being more cautious, more careful in many European countries. And of course, we see a rise, especially in violent anti-Semitism, to the extremes that we didn't see before.
Now, are the country leaders sort of doing enough to fight this phenomenon? And I guess what else can they do to combat this?
In order to combat vicious anti-Semitism, we first of all have to look for the roots. Who are the anti-Semites and why are they doing what they are? And we now have a phenomena in Europe in which the attacks come from both sides of the political spectrum, from the extreme right and from the extreme left/extreme radical Islamism. So it's not one phenomena, and countries are aware that they need to fight anti-Semitism on a number of levels. We have seen in recent years the appointment of special government officials and specialist departments in Germany, in France, in Britain, to combat anti-Semitism, and they are working together with local communities. They have programs, for example, for de-radicalization of extreme Muslims in prisons, working together with communities in places like Brussels, Berlin, London, Paris, and the south of France, where such extremism is ripe. The problem is that the rise of right-wing extremist parties in Europe also provides indirect support for such radicalization processes, and they are very difficult to reverse.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of the roots, maybe we can go into each country specifically. We can start with Germany. I mean, this is a country that, of course, given its history, has traditionally been very aware and very cautious of anti-Semitism. It's also a country where Holocaust education is taught in the curricula. So what is driving this increase in anti-Semitism in Germany today? Is it sort of the right-wing governments that you talked about, or are there other factors at play?
Again, Germany is being torn apart politically by the expansion of radical parties on both sides of the political spectrum. And especially since the migrants crisis of 2015, German society is finding it very difficult to manage issues relating to identity. But not just in Germany and France, in Britain, we see issues of identity always providing ammunition to the radicals, and one of the easy ways for them is turn against the Jews.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned France as well. What about in France? I mean, many are blaming the yellow vest protests for the rise in anti-Semitism, or the recent rise at least. But the truth is that it's been on the rise for far longer than the protests have been going on, which are only a few months. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on this?
The Yellow Vests protest is a very wide political protest, which is very difficult to pinpoint about specific agendas. Certainly, that movement has been penetrated by some radicals, and certainly they have perpetrated some forms of anti-Semitic attacks. But we have to remember that the major attacks came from radical Islamic terrorism in France, such as the attacks in Toulouse, such as the attacks at the Hyper Cacher kosher market in Paris, and other places. In France, there are over 5 million Muslim migrants. Most of them are peaceful people who want nothing but to have a better life for themselves and their families. But the radicals, the hotbeds, find it very easy to carry out attacks against Jews, as unfortunately we have seen in the past.
Okay, great. Professor Shapira, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you.